So my name is Lorraine Marchand, and I, at Columbia, teach a course on global healthcare, and I'm also on the healthcare advisory panel. I'm an alum of the business school myself. And professionally, I work for an organization called IQVIA, and I'm going to pause on that for a moment because I regularly get the question, what is IQVIA and what does it do? And that's because IQVIA was recently came into be as a company. So about 18 months ago, Quintiles, the largest contract research organization with deep clinical capabilities, merged with IMS Health, well known for the past 20-25 years for its ownership of pharmaceutical claims, lab, all of the data that's used by the pharmaceutical companies, particularly to help with their commercial pursuits, merged into one with an idea of creating a data and technology integrated platform that could provide insights to pharma companies across the continuum, so from discovery all the way through to commercialization. So IQVIA is also one of the companies in this whole data revolution that we're going to talk about today. You know, when I thought about preparing for today's panel and the students sitting in the room, I thought I might just share a little bit of a story with you. So the timeline is 1984, and I've just completed my undergraduate degree. I did a double major in biology and journalism, and I stepped into this industry. And this is what it looked like. So I started my career working at an academic medical center and then at the National Institutes of Health. And in 1984, clinical trials were conducted solely in white, middle-aged men. Women were not permitted to participate in clinical trials, and there certainly were no people of color in clinical trials. Now, the rationale was that women being of childbearing age, it was dangerous to place them in clinical trials. Fortunately, a woman by the name of Bernadine Healy came to the NIH, took over as its first woman director, and helped to change some of that. So in 1986, a policy moved forward to say, we have to figure out a way to include women in clinical trials because we can't just give women the same dose of a pill that we're giving a man. There are differences in biology and metabolism and all sorts of other things that we need to start to study. And shortly after that, the NIH launched the first Women's Health Initiative, which was a 10-year study looking at the impact of hormone replacement therapy on postmenopausal women. And it actually ended up with some pretty staggering findings in terms of who should be on HRT and who shouldn't. So that's what clinical trials looked like in 1984. Also in 1990, there was an arms race to map the genome. Right? So we talk today, precision medicine, it's hard to open up a page of fierce biotech that doesn't talk about precision medicine. So in 1990, Francis Collins at the NIH and his team, and Craig Venter at Celera, private company, started to do their own independent mapping of the human genome. And we were in an arms race to determine whether the public sector or the private sector was going to get there first. In around 2003, both put down their pens and completed that task. And the worry became, because Celera and Craig Venter talked about bringing all of that expertise in-house for the benefit of their own company and the drugs they would develop, there's a lot of talk about how we were going to democratize research and how we were going to make sure that we broadly applied the findings from the human genome so that it could benefit all of mankind. Also during this period of time, I can remember standing at the Food and Drug Administration on Fisher Lane in Rockville. No kidding. I'm standing there and 3 trucks pulled up and they unloaded box after box after box of paper reports and paper records, and I asked what was in the box. And that was the NDA submission, the new drug application submission for one drug from one pharma company. And we wonder why it took the FDA, 6 months to get back with this first round of questions when they had all of that paper that they had to pour through And it's also no wonder that they started their User Act, which allowed pharma companies to pay a small fee so that the FDA in turn could hire some additional consultants to help them get through all the boxes of paper. And finally, because we have someone here from the commercial side, I want him to have a story too, I was also thinking about what it was like during that period to gather consumer research. And yes, you had old-fashioned rotary phones, and market research companies would call you in the evening or maybe on a Sunday afternoon and hopefully get somebody who was willing to talk to them for 10 minutes to ask you consumer-type questions, or you might have a little box that you placed on your television set because the Nielsen company wanted to monitor your TV habits for maybe 4 days and try to understand what they could about your various behaviors and consumer habits. So that's what the world looked like in 1984. And our panelists represent today's view. And so 30 years forward, I think it's interesting to think about where we were, where we are, and that's an important background to talk about where we're going, because obviously the pace of change is much more rapid than it's been in that first 30-year period of time. So why don't I go ahead and ask our panel to introduce themselves. And my logic with this was Julie represents a discovery platform company, and Jeff from Regeneron represents a company that's using genomics for both discovery and development. Glen is on the clinical development side of our world, and Asaf is in the commercial sector. So we'll start with, I thought we'd start with discovery and have Julie introduce herself. And what I've asked them to do is, just give you maybe a point in their career arc that led them to their current path, something that would be interesting to share with you as you think about your careers in this industry.
Thank you. That was actually a really interesting introduction, and it changed what I wanted to say, which is great. So I'm Julie Rubinstein. Nice to meet all of you. I was a student, a typical student who was sort of pre-med, but toying with business and not really sure which direction to go in, which might apply to some of you. I chose the business route initially and went to Morgan Stanley in the healthcare group and actually took quintiles public, which is funny. And,
Small world, Julie.
Yeah, and that was actually the first data that I ever had any sort of exposure to, even though it wasn't the kind of data we talk about today. But I did at the time think, wow, that is really cool. And I was really excited by the data, but I don't have a data background or anything like that. But and then after Morgan Stanley, I went to a startup, but then I also went to business school. I went to HBS and I worked at Celera. And so that was my sort of internship when I was at HBS. And it was, again, my sort of exposure to data now, however many years later that was. And I remained really interested in the data side, but I also knew I wanted to go closer to science and learn the product side. And I wound up graduating HBS in '99 when pretty much 99% of the class went to an internet company, and I went to Johnson & Johnson and had a traditional carry-the-bag job, sold a breast cancer diagnostic device in Europe. And from that point forward, and for the last 18 years, I've been doing exclusively or mostly oncology work and going backwards closer and closer to the science. So I went from J&J to Pfizer and worked in the first franchise of cancer immunotherapy, and that's where I really solidified my desire to continue the rest of my career in immunology and how it intersects with all diseases, first oncology and then others. And again, going backwards in time back to science and data, happened to get lucky and come across the CEO of Adaptive Biotechnologies that was spinning out of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center about 9 years ago, and joined the company in 2011 as the first commercial employee to really productize this concept of sequencing the adaptive immune system, and that is what Adaptive does. We're really the only platform in the world that has this sort of data that's specific to the immune system, and we characterize T and B cell receptors that are the sort of front line of the immune system, and to be able to incorporate that data into our understanding of disease, how we diagnose disease, how we treat disease, and how we monitor response to disease and immune-mediated side effects to diseases and treatments for disease. So that cuts across oncology, autoimmune disease, infectious disease, and it really started as a response to what Celera did, which was to take what were at the time huge sequencing machines that now sit on a desktop but used to take up half a room. And you could sequence the entire human genome, but it actually excluded the cells of the immune system. And so the initial ask of Adaptive was to take that huge machinery and apply it to the constantly rearranging cells of the adaptive immune system, and that's how the technology was formed and it got started. And I'm currently the president of the company, which is kind of new and just happened a couple weeks ago, so it's really exciting times for us as we are continuing to grow the database. You may have seen we did a big partnership with Microsoft to bring tech and biotech together to apply sequencing and machine learning to really expedite the pace at which we can map the entire immunome and change the way we diagnose disease. We have our first diagnostic going through the FDA for approval this year to monitor blood cancers, and we have a therapeutic discovery initiative as well. And as you'll hear from others, we work really closely with pharma across the continuum, looking at discovery all the way through to monitoring for side effects for their drugs in these different disease categories, but largely in oncology. Thanks.
So hi, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Reid. I'm the head of Genome Informatics at the Regeneron Genetics Center. In terms of my career trajectory and a pivot that maybe some of the students will find interesting, my background is actually computational physics. So I am fundamentally, first and foremost, a scientist. I'm probably quite different than most of the people in the room here who have a business background. And as I was finishing a PhD in physics, I quite arrogantly had heard about the genome being finished, and I thought, well, I understand a lot about the early universe now. The human genome should be cool, and that'll be interesting. So I should go do that. I was extremely lucky that as I made this transition, sequencing technology companies had, as I was doing my postdoc, come up with a technology that could sort of meet my aspiration for being able to compute on the genome. So I was finishing my postdoc just as Illumina was buying Solexa and ended up building analytical pipelines at the Human Genome Sequencing Center at Baylor College of Medicine, one of the primary large-scale sequencing labs that was funded by the NIH at the time. And then again, maybe somewhat arrogantly and extremely lucky, got this really strange opportunity to go to this pharma company that I had never heard of. Why would I? I'm a scientist, right? Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, and where is Tarrytown, New York? I've never heard of that. But it was really, really exciting, this idea that there was a company out there that was fundamentally committing to doing science as a sort of key part of its business. And so I came on at the end of 2013 to help really bring along the idea of genome sequencing at Regeneron. And now, of course, I think we've been relatively successful as an effort at the Regeneron Genetics Center. So that's sort of how I ended up where I am. And if I have any piece of advice for students in making a pivot, don't be afraid of making a big change, but you should maybe be a little more aware of what you're changing to than I was, because I just got very, very lucky.
My name is Glen DeVries. I'm the president and co-founder of Medidata. I also started on the science side. If you asked me in 1995 what I'd be doing today, I wouldn't be in front of a business school conference. It would be in front of a class of biology students at some university teaching cell biology. And what happened was, at the bench, I had a refrigerator full of tubes of blood from patients. I had paper lab notebooks that were bursting at the seams with data, which was recorded on duplicate forms, so there was a copy that could be submitted to somebody else in addition to my own copy. I had spreadsheets. I had a scientific calculator, old school, and I would spend my time in between runs of the PCR machine that I kept running for every hour I could possibly stay awake and be in the lab, sitting in front of the hospital information system at Columbia, actually getting the follow-up data for my patients. I knew nothing about the pharmaceutical industry, but I figured that this horrible stuff that I did in the lab and what I thought was a microcosm of clinical research had to be much better in that world. And what I discovered was what I was doing in the lab, what I just described, was not kind of a metaphorical mini version of clinical research. It was exactly what happens in clinical research, and wound up with those trucks full of paper being delivered to the FDA. So actually, I think in my case, it was incredibly naively, and also I got incredibly lucky. We decided to try to fix that. And now, what Medidata does is we take the scientists who are working on research, we take the physicians and the patients and the people who are clinical research professionals, for example, at companies like IQVIA, and they turn on their computer or they open their phone, and that's how they do their research on our platform now.
So my story also started in kind of a very different place and different direction. I studied computer science. I graduated in Tel Aviv. After my military service, I knew I wanted to start a company. I joined another person. And really, we didn't have any context. We just looked at what was the best-selling consumer application at the time, and that was Quicken for personal finance management. And we said, okay, after finance, what's the next most important thing for people? So healthcare sounded like, oh, let's do Quicken for health. That sounded to make a lot of sense. Of course, we didn't realize who's going to pay for that, who's going to buy it. Would consumer actually pay to manage their own health information? This is the mid-90s. So we actually started down that path, and the internet came along. We turned it into an internet-based patient engagement environment. And we went to all of the healthcare stakeholders trying to sell this great, better way for patients to manage their own information. So providers didn't know what to do with us. Payers thought it's interesting. We had meetings, but nothing happened. Pharma companies started actually buying this, and they bought it because they felt that from a commercial standpoint, it could help them build a long-term relationship with patients, enhance patient adherence to medication, which was an interest of theirs, and as well as get their name out there from kind of a new patient start standpoint, allowing them from a marketing standpoint to do fairly well. So I would say that this was very much a journey that I fell into healthcare, and the value proposition came way after the conception of the company and the product. The company was doing very well, and through that, I was asked by my clients, so how do we assess the impact of these patient environments? It sounds very cool. We have this multiple sclerosis community, lots of people communicate, messaging, lots of the nice features that you could do from a technology standpoint. And my answer was at the time, well, however do you measure everything else that you do? And it became clear that at the time there was no way to link like a patient engagement at scale with the healthcare data of these individuals to be actually deliver on kind of outcomes. You could do surveys. On the physician side, there was plenty of data from companies like IMS that existed for decades. And with that challenge, there wasn't much we could do. There wasn't a better way of doing it. The dot-com crash came along. We ended up selling the company, and I was left with a challenge. So how can you solve that problem of linking data? If you think about it from an analytical standpoint, the more data you have, the more insights you can glean out of that. And it's not just healthcare data that you want to connect, it's all the data that you can connect. It could be TV viewership data, it could be what people buy, it could be geolocation data, it could be any data. The more data you can connect, the more insights you have the opportunity to go after. But the bigger problem is that the more data you connect, the more likely you are to compromise privacy, to re-identify the data. So that's the conflict, and that led me to kind of think about this problem of can you go about it in a different way, which led to the development of a patent and then the formation of a company. And this journey, this is the company that I run now, Crossix. This company started in a very opposite way to my first company. In this company, I knew exactly what the client wanted to answer. I knew exactly what was the unmet need. And as we did what we had to do in terms of raising some capital and building the technology, filing the patent applications, securing data relationships, within a week of being ready, we had a paying client, and a month later it turned into an annual subscription. So a very different journey. And just so what we do is we have a foundation that is this analytics technology that overcomes the problem that I described of being able to connect data of all kinds and without running to that limitation. The solution that we took is a distributed approach. It will take more than an intro to describe exactly how is it different and the benefits. But over the years, we ended up securing more and more data, healthcare data, prescription data, electronic medical record data, and just lots of different types of data at scale, but also many other types of data sets. You mentioned Nielsen and how the data collection on the TV side, the media side, has evolved. So as you probably know, at this point, it's not any longer just on a few households that have something on their TV to measure viewership. Data gets collected at scale from all of us by monitoring digitally what the set-top box data, the cable box that you have does, as well as any other digital channel. So loyalty card data from how people buy in supermarkets, lots of other types of data sets. And you could use this for many different things. This can inform, the fundamental idea that how we behave in the healthcare system is a part of how we behave in general as human beings when we don't interact with the healthcare system. The direction we took this is the commercial landscape. How can you take all of these connections in data to essentially help an entity in health that wants to understand their customer base, that wants to reach them, that wants to optimize their commercial activities, be able to do that based on rich data. And that's kind of what Crossix does, and this has been kind of my personal journey. I would definitely say a lot of this, most of it unplanned,
So I want to stay on the company for just another minute or two before we launch more fully into data, because we've got 4 entities here that have grown from being startups to successful companies. I know have terrific stories to tell in terms of the challenges that they had to face being on the front line of this change, right? Getting particularly the life science community comfortable with data, the collection of data, how to use the data, again, pharma being somewhat conservative. And I know, Glen, you had a particularly interesting story to share in terms of a pivot that you had to make, or a sort of a moment of truth for Medidata. So what was one or two things that you had to overcome in the early days of Medidata, maybe around your IPO and that sort of thing?
I think one of the things that was important, not so much as a pivot, but is that I don't think we actually do anything, at least at Medidata, that's fundamentally different than the way the pharmaceutical industry, I think quite responsibly, thought about the science of showing that something is safe and something is effective for patients. The techniques were wildly different. So instead of putting everything in a notebook, it all winds up traveling over the internet and winding up in databases instead of using a scientific calculator and SPSS and maybe a traditional frequentist approach to how many times do I have to flip the coin to figure out whether it comes up more heads or tails. You use Bayesian techniques and look at bigger sets of data. But I think a big thing that we kind of had to deal with was the fact that everybody looked at the technology as kind of a little shiny new object, when actually the way we're doing things is totally grounded in hundreds of years, thousands of years of the scientific method, and certainly at least decades and decades of traditional research. And I think even today, that applies. So we look at all these new sources of data. Yes, it's different than looking to see if a patient's blood pressure went from being high to being low. We're looking at extremely complex, interconnected sets of genomic data and phenotypic data. I mean, Jeff's the expert on this stuff. But ultimately, we're just looking to see if we can move the needle in terms of a patient's longevity and quality of life. And I think convincing the FDA that what we were doing wasn't any different than what they were doing in the past, convincing pharmaceutical companies that this wasn't a revolution. Maybe it's disruptive in terms of its impact, but it's an evolution. I think that's been one of the most important things that we kind of went through. I know we were talking about a different thing on the phone, but I think that's how I decided to answer that.
All right, that's fine. Fair. And Jeff, do you want to maybe elaborate on some of the challenges past, but also the challenges that you see in the future in terms of being able to use the data, and in your case, the genomics data, in order to inform discovery and development?
Sure. I would say that first and foremost, one of the things that I have seen large-scale sequencing efforts fail on is samples. And so one of the things that was really pivotal in the launch of the Regeneron Genetics Center was, at the very beginning, not trying to do something aspirationally, but only saying, this is a thing that we are doing for real, which means we have to have actual real samples to start sequencing today. We can't just buy sequencers and say, we're going to sequence 2 million people and do all sorts of things with their data, and then run around and say, hey, so you're a person, can I have your data? No, you have to actually fundamentally build a scientific strategy and a business strategy that includes the resources that you need to get to the answers you need. And so the thing that was really pivotal early on at the RGC was our partnership with Geisinger, our partnerships with other academic groups. And I think that really came out of sort of two prongs. One is we're fundamentally a company of scientists. And so we're scientists talking to other scientists. When we're doing projects, our projects are driven by research plans. We actually force people internally and externally to articulate what scientific question are you asking, which avoids the research plan I like to call samples plus sequencing equals awesome, which is very many of the large-scale sequencing projects you'll see out there. It's kind of like, well, I have all these samples, and so I should sequence them, and then that'll be awesome, right? And the answer is, well, no, if you don't know what scientific question you're asking, then you will not actually get any answers that are of any value to anyone. So that perspective of knowing we needed samples to actually build something and not just buy sequencers and say we're doing something, being very careful about what science we're trying to do. And then the third piece is really to you all on the business side, being able to build public-private partnerships, being able to have an entity like Regeneron as a pharmaceutical company making a partnership with an academic lab that's funded by the NIH, or a group like the UK Biobank that's really something that's being done for public benefit. And I'm going to go ahead and call him out. Actually, Mike Norson is here today. He's one of the leaders within the RGC who has been pivotal in our ability to make those public-private partnerships.
Julie, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I have to say that everything you just said resonates so strongly with me. I would say, in addition to that, from our perspective, the build it and they will come philosophy, I think, really doesn't apply in this setting. And you're seeing that now time and time again. You have to have a purpose, an actual clinical purpose, so that you don't just sequence any data, but that you purposefully select data and do the kinds of partnerships that Jeff was talking about to ensure that that data will build on itself and actually end with a product at the end of the day. And that's something that was hard at Adaptive initially, years and years ago, because the immune system touches on every disease, including ones that we didn't really understand how implicated the immune system is in those diseases, like even mental health, Alzheimer's. It's so pervasive. And we as a company had to prioritize and not try to do everything right out of the gates, and to actually form the types of partnerships that Jeff was talking about to study particular diseases over many, many years, and then become a product company at the end of the day, because you have to build the infrastructure to take that science and make it applicable to clinicians and relevant to patients. And that transition from big idea, big data, to actually impactful products that change the paradigm of the way in which patients are treated in particular disease states is a very long learning cycle that is really important for any company. And I think that the companies that are just, raising lots of money and building some big database is much, much harder, and or they'll learn along the way that doesn't last forever.
Yeah. Just for the audience, because we throw this term big data around, and I think that it could have lots of different definitions to people. Anybody want to give us the definition of big data? I know some of you. I'll call on you if you don't raise your hand. Yes, please, go ahead.
That's kind of like unstructured data.
Yeah. So, one of the, the advent of electronic medical records, electronic health records, brought with it the ability for us to gather unstructured data about a patient from the physician's notes, to add in images, scans, and other types of information that doesn't so nicely fit in, let's say, a case report form, where everything is numeric. So that's what sort of has given us this whole advent of big data. And, we hear time and time again that one of the challenges with big data is actually trying to make some sense of it and integrating it certainly with genomic data or, with the immune data that Julie's speaking of. So I'd like to ask the panel, maybe without getting too technical, why is it so difficult to bring all these different data sources together? And until we sort of crack the code on it, how are you able to generate useful insights? And I'd like you to also touch on machine learning and artificial intelligence which Julie mentioned. So make some sense of this whole data paradigm for us. Maybe start with whomever would like to jump in, Jeff or...
I would like to expand the at least definition of like this big data problem to include structured data as well. So actually your gene sequence is a beautifully structured data set. It's a bunch of 2-bit numbers. The trick is then to your point, kind of combine it with other things. And I think the most important thing that I think a lot of companies get wrong, and this I think Julie intimated to as well, is that you've got to have that data in a state that is fit for purpose for the analysis that you intend to do. Right? And I think that's where a lot of these data strategies, either companies themselves or the strategies within companies, I certainly have an interesting seat in the life sciences world because we work with about 1,000 different companies. Most of them have data strategies and most of them fail. And they fail because they lean on this idea of I'm going to integrate data. Sorry, I shouldn't say integrate. They will co-locate data. Right? They aggregate as much as they can and they high five because they've got big data, but they haven't actually done the work to integrate it and make meaningful connections between a patient's gene sequence and what's happening in their immune system and the numeric data that was recorded on a CRF page in a clinical trial and what their long-term survival was in a healthcare database. I can think of scenarios that would be useful in, but they haven't done the work, the hard work to get that data actionable. And then you have people who rely on the buzzwords of machine learning and artificial intelligence and cognitive, which as far as I can tell is just programming, that nobody's actually thinking usually. But all these magical words are supposed to solve all these big data problems, but there's an adage in computer science, which is garbage in, garbage out. And it applies 100% to big data, and actually worse, nothing in always equals nothing out. So all these algorithms don't do that. And I think, so I really think that the key here from a business perspective, where we do see the successes, is when people have a very specific set of questions that they've decided they are going to try to answer. They gather the necessary data sources to do that, knowing that they've got a lot of work to do to make that data integrated in a fit-for-purpose way, and then you can apply the right algorithms to do that. It's not that different than what we used to do in our chemistry classes when we wrote out the protocol in the notebook, did the experiment, and then wrote out the conclusions. Again, I think we're very well served by our old scientific teachings.
Yeah, I just have to jump in. So I've often said that my spirit animal is grumpy cat, okay? And one of the reasons I say that is I get viscerally angry about some of and the technical term here is bullshit, that flies around things like big data and machine learning. So
that only took 30 minutes. That's pretty good.
So basically, all right, I'm gonna break it down for you. So big data is any data that doesn't fit in one computer. As soon as you need 2 computers, it's big data. So there are some very small data sets that are actually sort of considered big data. There's some very, very large data sets that you can actually treat in kind of small data ways. But fundamentally, when people talk about big data, they're talking about parallelizing an analysis or some kind of compute across multiple computers. So it can be things of various sizes. It can include, of course, both structured and unstructured data. Now, unstructured data is much more difficult to deal with than structured data because at least it has a structure. But the rule is if there's a structure, it better be followed because nothing is worse than structured data that doesn't obey its own structure. right? That's a huge problem. And then just one last rant. So the machine learning AI thing, that's linear regression with a publicist, okay? This is not magic. These are mathematical equations, these are formalisms, these are things that have been derived in the 17 and 1800s, right? These are not things that are new. So the idea somehow that there's this guy in a black hoodie, you know, who sits in a cafe somewhere, who's like learning on all this data, and no, that's not how it is. It's like somebody with a white shirt drinking coffee, sitting in front of a laptop who's running a bunch of linear regressions and then getting some insights that may or may not be right. And they may or may not be right because of the quality and the cleanliness of the data. So the idea of harmonizing the data, making the data exactly, be able to answer the question that you're asking, that's the important part. This other stuff is all just noise, and there are a lot of people who are making a lot of money off of that noise because they're VCs that are investing in these companies. If they can convince you all that they're worth $1 billion, then one of you all may convince someone to give them $1 billion. So they have a motivation for this, but it's not real.
Okay, Julie, counterpoint.
Okay, I just want to make two points. One is the point of staying focused is something I mentioned before about, products, but also on the data side. We've been asked many, many times, since we now have a lab that sequences tens of thousands of samples all the time from cancer patients, why don't we also do mutations from tumor tissue? Why do we only sequence the immune system? And I think the answer to that question is exactly what Glen said. You need to stay focused on what you do best. Like, understanding the data that comes out of the immune system is so different than tumor mutation burden in a cancer. And sure, we could do that also, but that's like starting a separate, like a second business within Adaptive, and would have taken away our focus from going really, really deep and being accurate and precise so that we're certain of the answers that we're providing with the analysis that's specific just to the T and B cell receptors in the host response. And we made a very strategic decision to do that early on. What I would differ a little bit on is, at least in our case, the purpose of adding machine learning on is very specific also to what we are now just learning about the immune system, which is that there are billions of T cell receptors and a much smaller number of antigens that are the little pieces of disease that your immune system sees. And even with machine learning, we will never get to the full, complete picture of every single receptor. That's, each of us have so many millions of different receptors, and some number of them match with the more limited set of antigens. And so you actually do need machine learning in the same way that it does facial recognition to be able to complete the map of the entire immunome, because it's going to do the same thing it does in facial recognition, where it studies faces enough so that when a new face enters into the system, it can assess that face. And we need that technology to be able to map the entire immunome. So there's a very specific purpose for the integration of machine learning and sequencing as it relates to the enormity and ever-changing immune system that exists in all of us, to be able to study it at a population level.
I don't think anybody would. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. Like, machine learning, it's not. It's real. Like, these algorithms real and they work. It's pattern recognition, right? And again, it just goes to what data is fit for purpose. So okay, we sequence the human genome, and a lot of people in the life sciences industry is like, great, now we're going to cure everything, right? And the answer was we couldn't, right? Because diseases are complicated. Absolutely. And physiology that sits on top of your gene sequence, all the layers of omics and your environment, everything, you need to have all the right information integrated. That is a great use case, which is, I think, what you're doing in a piece of that for some of these machine learning techniques, and you can actually make steps in the right direction. But we can't cure disease the way Mendel bred his peas.
And because I am a pessimist about the hype, I am an optimist about machine learning, just to be clear. There are a lot of great use cases, but also you can quantify the degree to which these things actually work, right? So you can take a large data set, you can break it into a training set and a validation set and a test set, right? And then you can train it, and then you can do a validation, then you can do a test, and the whole mechanism of machine learning involves the quantification of the fitness of the solution, right? So there are things you can do to speak to that. that's different than just sort of waving your hands and trying to raise money by saying, I'm going to machine learn all this.
Okay.
Just
Let me
to-
let Asaf, please
Just
jump
to
in.
look at it from the commercial perspective, which is kind of an interesting lens to this, because if you think about what life science companies do from a commercial standpoint, it actually touches things that are not healthcare at all. It touches, the mobile revolution. It touches the media revolution. It touches other things that are going on that are creating different types of data sets that did not exist at all. It creates this notion that you can now look at things fundamentally differently than you could in the past. This also would require connecting data sets that historically you simply could not bring, either did not exist, and even if they do exist, the whole idea that I'm just going to get all of this data that I need about the world in one place, clean, fit for analysis, and then be able to do it, is just such a big challenge. It's not going to happen, and privacy many times is a big issue, but there are other challenges in getting that data. The data itself has an interesting element to that. If you think about the amounts of data generated, again, not necessarily in healthcare, just as human beings, and if you believe that that data could be interesting to healthcare, then you need to be able to accommodate some of that. In general, I agree with all of the difference between hype and reality. I agree about this notion that you need to start with a problem and ensure that you're focused on the applications that are going to drive value around that. I also agree that a lot of the math and ideas that we talk about are not new ideas. We can now do them at a different scale. That definitely matters. The scale matters. If you can run it on much bigger data sets and you can do it more quickly, and you can run not one, but you could run millions of these, you'll get better results this way. Fundamentally, though, we need to be careful about the hype. We need to be careful about just saying, oh, let's just get all the data, or somehow even more simplistically that we can get it all and put it in one place.
Yeah, and let's talk now for a minute or two about our biopharma stakeholders. So they're the ones who need this data to derive the insights and have it influence their discovery and development so that they can accelerate the whole drug development to market process. Regeneron's an interesting model because they've developed their own genetic center within the company, although it has some firewalls around it. From my perspective, what our pharma clients struggle with is this whole idea of what are the critical questions? And then once I do know the critical questions, how do I go about querying the data and assembling it in the right fashion so that I can, derive meaningful insights? And we can comment on that, but it also leads to a point that I heard some large companies make at JP Morgan this year. So very large multinational device and biopharma companies, which is the thing that's holding them back is actually internal capabilities and talent. They just don't have the teams that have the technology backgrounds, to some extent have the digital backgrounds. We saw a lot of digital examples of using sensors and pulling in that kind of data from our United Health spokesperson. So I think that, what I'd like the panel to be able to comment on is what kind of talent is required in order to help to optimize this opportunity that we now have with data and with insights. And for the students sitting in the room today, some of whom don't have scientific backgrounds or didn't just sort of happen into the industry. They're really deliberating, their paths and how they can prepare for exciting careers in this industry. What are your recommendations to them? Well, that really quieted them down.
I'll dive in. It's not going to surprise people. I have a lot of opinions.
Okay.
So everybody should know how to code. Everybody should know how to code. And it doesn't mean that you have to spend your entire life writing code, but until you understand the formalism of trying to understand an algorithm for yourself enough that you can articulate that algorithm in code and then run it and see the results, you don't really understand computing. And computing is absolutely, saying it's the future is ridiculous because it's the right now. So people really have to know that. And finding people who have the right mixture of the ability to think about problems computationally as well as understanding things in biology and healthcare and understanding things in business is very, very rare. So if you already have one of those skills, clearly some talented business people in the room, if you get one or two or both of those other skills, that will be extremely valuable.
Okay, so for those who have antibodies, or have antibodies to coding, can we give them?
Well, so I'll be slightly more happy cat than grumpy cat. I think every team needs to know how to code, and I think if you're going to work in healthcare, you better know what the fuck you're doing with patients, right? And because this is a real problem. Somebody did you use the term validate? Like, we need to work in a world where we can feel good about the decisions that we're making about how we are treating these patients. And we need to use the tools that are available to us, which is why we need to know how to code. And so I actually think a very thoughtful thing you can do from a business perspective, I hope we try to model this at Medidata, is get the people who know how to not just code a little bit, but really code a lot, or really think about data in a deep way, and pair them with people who have the right healthcare background, the right regulatory backgrounds to do it in a responsible way so that you can, it's a term of art, but actually validate what you are trying to bring to market. And I think literally a couple days ago, there's an example of this. Yes, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is the first time that the FDA approved something based on metastatic-free survival extension for a Johnson & Johnson prostate cancer treatment. It was just kind of an endpoint that you don't normally see. What do we mean by an endpoint? Somebody did the mathematical work to validate that if we can stop people's cancers from spreading, then this is a worthy pill for them to take. And it's that validation problem is one that includes coding, it includes understanding the physiology of why stopping metastatic cancer from spreading makes sense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like a big data version of that kind of validation, but actually now take what they did to show that there was a different endpoint to look at and supersize it to the kind of data that we could be bringing to the table about people's immune systems, about their lifestyle habits. I think what we're going to see is bigger and bigger validated concepts in terms of how we can manage people's healthcare better. That excites me, but you need the multidisciplinary team.
Okay. 2 minutes on career recommendations, because I do want to open it up to the group so we get some of their questions too. And if you want to talk about Flatiron or Nebula Genomics, these guys are all over it.
Please,
just as a tip.
please say
ask
blockchain
him.
in front of Jeff, please.
Please ask him. All right,
I'm waiting. I'm ready.
let me finish.
We'll get some water.
Well, hold. Now, that'll keep you in the room. Julie and Asaf, recommendations. If somebody was going to come to you for a job, business student, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I would say that the comments that were made before are very relevant. The idea that in what we do, it's multidisciplines that have to come together. And usually being super strong in one of them and completely unaware of the others and not even be able to work in a team to kind of appreciate and understand it, that would be the biggest issue. So from what I see, things are getting more and more complex. The technology itself is is with more possibilities. There's a lot of depth in each area, and at the same time, to extract that value that we all talked about, to do it with a purpose, you need kind of a more complete view than what I think was required when I started my career, where it was okay to just do coding.
Okay. Thank you. Julie?
So I think it's really important to be passionate about what you do. So I think that is the number one thing that separates people at Adaptive who are clearly the go-to people for everything, regardless of what function they come from. It totally doesn't matter. We're getting a filing into the FDA. I know the 15 people in the organization who are going to make that happen, and they may come from computational biology, software, marketing, the lab. It doesn't matter. They're passionate about the fact that we are creating a new endpoint for patients with blood cancer, measuring minimal residual disease and tracking that cancer. And if we can identify those patients who actually are not in molecular remission but are mistakenly taken off treatment or vice versa, we're going to do that. And so the people who have the passion, who are willing to go the extra mile, who want to learn the other functions, it's not even so much about working well with others. I don't know, I have 3 kids and they're all going through school right now, and it's all about sitting around a table and this sort of like somewhat fake how they work together. I think it's really the kid at the table who's passionate about the project and takes the lead, and everybody else wants to make it happen are the people that we look for at Adaptive.
Okay. All right. Who wants to hear their opinions about Roche's acquisition of Flatiron? Anybody? Okay. All right. Go for it. This is going to be.
So Roche is over.
But be polite.
Roche is over its history. Thanks, Mom. Roche is over its history.
I feel like those were just wasted words, you know.
Roche has, over its history, acquired a variety of genetics companies, and so the somewhat unkind characterization I have made in the past is Roche is where genetics companies go to die, and but Roche is a very successful, very smart company that does really great things. So how do we marry those two ideas? And the way we marry those two ideas is Roche is acquiring these companies for its purposes. It is not necessarily, historically with genetics companies, it has not historically necessarily been acquiring them to acquire a business that is intended to maintain an external customer base. And so the thing that I don't know, I think it's too soon to know, is the intention to acquire Flatiron so that they can continue with the business of Flatiron, or is it the intention to acquire Flatiron to serve some internal need that may be opaque to the rest of the world? And my guess is, based on what I've seen with other genetics companies, obviously not really a genetics company, but sort of, is it's probably more likely for an internal purpose, so it's less likely to be expansive as some kind of customer business, but I don't know. I'm just a scientist.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in?
I'm
no?
Jeff.
Okay. Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I think that's a very valid perspective. The one acquisition they did make with Foundation Medicine has been definitely, they definitely want that data to, curate that data to develop their drugs. But Foundation has also done really well since the acquisition in growing its business and growing its database and all the information behind the, panels that they run on cancer patients. So it'll be interesting to see. I definitely think first and foremost, they want the data for their drug development. Yeah. But at least in the case of Foundation, and Mike Bellini just joined our board actually, it's been pretty successful. So we'll see. I don't know as much about Flatiron as I do about.
And it's one way to bring the talent into the organization, right? The capabilities. Yeah. I mean, it's why Pfizer bought Wyeth and, and really pushed their way into the biologics. It's a much faster way than trying to develop it organically. So we'll have to wait and see.
Oh, I was going to say, I think if you look at a lot of these companies, some that Roche has acquired, inclusive, there is going to be more sophisticated disease management models. I mean, I think all of us are in one way or another working on aspects, or we have our hands on at least one part of that elephant. And I think an interesting question is who has the talent and who has the money to develop sophisticated disease management, not just algorithms, but platforms. And pharma is going to be one of those people. So if it results in me being able to get a great cancer drug at the same time as all of these measurements about my life are being incorporated and I get better therapy, then great. I mean, that would be, not that it's going to die in that, but that those kind of acquisitions can lead to that, I think is a potential good thing. And I see the capitalism in life sciences as probably a positive driver of disease management platforms existing for all of us as patients. So I think that's positive.
All right, very good. So questions from the audience. What's on your mind? Oh, we have a couple. All right. Yes, go ahead. I think they'll need you to speak into the mic. Yeah. Your name, please?
My name is Su Zhang. I graduated from Columbia Business School, 1996.
1996.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Welcome.
Now I have a question on blockchain, actually, application.
Oh, blockchain, yes! They want to be asked about blockchain, good.
Yeah, very simple question. In addition to medical records application, what's your view of the best application of blockchain in medicine?
So you're probably thinking of George Church's announcement of nebula genomics, right?
Wow.
That's one application of blockchain.
Absolutely.
But I'll let them chime in. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think so clearly the killer app for blockchain is the black market. This is why Bitcoin is huge, right? I'm serious. Like the ability to have a currency that fundamentally doesn't depend on a government makes it so you can have a currency with which it is easy to operate in the black market. So I personally think most of the value of Bitcoin is driven by value in the black market. That said, it is a platform with which people can share data in a secure way. But the thing I point out to people is everybody in this room has gone to Starbucks and swiped their card. And that data is not being stored in the blockchain, right? That data is, you're just trusting that Starbucks is going to be a good steward of your credit card number, and they're not going to sell it to somebody, and they're going to treat it, respectfully as a customer. Why would that change in healthcare? I think it's a solution in search of an answer. In healthcare, I don't see it as seeing anything that's necessary, and my beef with Nebula is not necessarily with Nebula. It's just there's a whole bunch of companies that are doing that. I don't understand why we're talking about Nebula and not Luna, right? Like there's just a bunch of companies trying something in that space, and maybe some of them will succeed, but I don't see the value.
But blockchain is a real thing. It's a technique that you can use to make sure that a kind of chain of information, literally, it has integrity, and there's also ways to distribute it. So I think there probably are really good use cases for that that require you to keep the integrity of a chain. So I'll use an example. CAR T therapy, Novartis introduced something where at your hospital, people take blood out of you, it gets genetically altered and reintroduced to you, and you definitely don't want somebody else's blood reintroduced to you in that process. That is certainly not going to work. So that's a place where I think if you said to me, can we go solve that problem and make it scalable with technologies, you might pull blockchain off the shelf.
Even then.
Right?
Even then, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But there's nothing that makes it more trustworthy and useful than any other kind of encryption or database, I think, and that's why I think there's a lot of hype right now.
It's secure logging with a publicist.
The problems in healthcare that usually are not about this distributed ledger. And even if distributed ledger has a component in it, it's, in my view, would tend to be a small component relative to what you're trying to solve from a healthcare standpoint.
I think there's actually an interesting business thing that from a hype perspective, a lot of these companies are trying to do, and they're trying to make it sound like if you're using a blockchain, you're trustworthy.
Yes.
And I do think this is going to be a really interesting thing in a lot of different sectors, certainly healthcare. A lot of people used to have a business model of hoarding data. That is not going to work in the future. There's other ways to get data. It's like the little velociraptors in Jurassic Park. It escapes, right? So you can get the data. And then I think there are companies that are now quite sensibly, I think we're working at some of them, trying to do that kind of steel thread of I've got the right data, I'm putting the right algorithms on it, I'm delivering some kind of actionable value. But having the right data to begin with, I think this kind of next business era is going to be that you've actually earned people's trust. They want you to have that data. Trust is not an aspiration. Trust is something that you actually have to build over time. And again, I just don't believe somebody that says, trust me because I'm using blockchain. That's just not true.